Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the Black Death. And trust me, by the time we're done exploring this fascinating yet deliberately boring history, you'll be well on your way to dreamland. You know how it works here. We take amazing historical topics and present them in the most sleep-inducing way possible. No dramatic music, no sudden loud noises, just my voice taking you on a gentle journey through time. If this channel has been helping you fall asleep, please hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us create more of these boring historical bedtime stories for everyone who struggles with insomnia. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you want, and let's discover how the Black Death shaped our world, one yawn at a time. Think you're having a rough day? Wait until you hear what it was like to live through the greatest pandemic in human history. The Black Death, as it would later be called, killed somewhere between 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population in just a few short years. Imagine walking through your neighbourhood and finding every other house empty, their occupants either fled or dead. Imagine the smell of burning bodies filling the air, the sound of church bells constantly tolling for the dead, and the terrifying realisation that no one, not doctors, priests or kings, had any idea how to stop the relentless spread of disease. This was the reality for those who lived during the mid-14th century, and tonight we'll explore why you, with all your modern sensibilities and expectations, wouldn't last a single day in this world of almost unimaginable suffering. To understand the Black Death, we must first journey back to a world very different from our own. Medieval Europe in the early 14th century was a place of stark contrasts and rigid hierarchies. The vast majority of people were peasants who worked the land, living in small villages scattered across the countryside. Towns and cities existed, but they were small by our standards, with even major cities like London or Paris housing only tens of thousands of residents. Life for most people revolved around agriculture and the changing seasons. The medieval diet consisted primarily of bread, porridge, seasonal vegetables, and occasional meat for those who could afford it. Healthcare was primitive, combining elements of Greek and Roman medical theories with local folk remedies and Christian religious practices. The medieval worldview was deeply religious. The Catholic Church dominated all aspects of life in Western Europe, providing not just spiritual guidance, but also education, healthcare, and charity. Most people believed that illness was either a punishment from God for sins or the result of an imbalance in the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This was the world into which the plague would soon arrive. The origins of the Black Death lie far from Europe, in the vast grasslands and deserts of Central Asia. The disease was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which normally infected rodents and their fleas. But sometime in the early 14th century, this bacterium began to spread more widely, possibly due to changes in climate that affected rodent populations. The Silk Road, that great network of trade routes connecting East Asia with the Middle East and Europe, served as the perfect highway for the disease. Merchant caravans unknowingly carried infected rats and fleas in their wagons and ships, spreading the disease from town to town, from port to port. By 1346, the plague had reached the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. According to contemporary accounts, the city of Kaffa, now Feodosia in Crimea, was besieged by a Mongol army when the disease broke out among the Mongol troops. In what might be one of history's earliest examples of biological warfare, the Mongols reportedly catapulted corpses of plague victims over the city walls, infecting the inhabitants. When Italian merchants fled Kaffa by sea, they unwittingly carried the plague to the ports of the Mediterranean. Sicily was among the first European regions to be hit. In October 1347, merchant ships docked in Messina with dead and dying men at their oars. The authorities quickly ordered the ships back to sea, but it was too late. The disease had already come ashore. From Sicily, the plague spread rapidly throughout Italy. By January 1348, it had reached Marseille in France and ports in Islamic North Africa. By June, it was in Paris and London. Within 2 years, it had reached as far north as Norway and as far east as Russia. Few places were spared. If you were transported back to a European city in the grips of the Black Death, the first thing that would strike you would be the smell. Medieval cities were not known for their cleanliness at the best of times. Garbage and human waste were often simply thrown into the streets. Animals like pigs and chickens wandered freely. But during the plague, the stench of death would be overwhelming. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. In many places, the normal funeral customs were abandoned entirely. Instead of individual burials with proper ceremonies, corpses were thrown into mass graves, dozens or even hundreds at a time. In some cities, authorities dug enormous pits outside the walls and filled them with layer upon layer of dead. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, wrote that these pits were like trenches for soldiers. When one was filled, another was dug beside it. You would notice the silence too. Economic activity ground to a halt in many places. Markets were abandoned, shops closed, fields left unharvested. The normal bustle of urban life was replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the tolling of church bells, announcing yet another death, and the calls of the dead carts as they made their rounds. "Bring out your dead," the cart drivers would call as they collected bodies from house to house. The disease itself manifested in several forms, but the most common was bubonic plague. This form was characterized by swollen, painful lymph nodes, called buboes, hence the name. These buboes typically appeared in the neck, armpit or groin, and could grow as large as an apple. They were often described as hot, painful, and hard to the touch. As the disease progressed, the buboes might burst, releasing pus and blood. Other symptoms included high fever, headaches, and vomiting. Many victims developed dark purple blotches on their skin, caused by internal bleeding, hence the later name, the Black Death. Some coughed up blood. Most died within 2 to 7 days of showing symptoms. The mortality rate for the bubonic form was around 60 to 80%. For those who developed the pneumonic or septicemic forms, which affected the lungs or blood respectively, death was almost certain. If you were to fall ill with the plague in medieval Europe, your options for treatment would be severely limited. Medieval medicine was based largely on the theory of the 4 humours, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. According to this theory, the body contained 4 basic substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or choler, and black bile, or melancholy. Health depended on these humours being in proper balance. Illness resulted when they became imbalanced. Faced with the plague, doctors tried to restore this balance through various means. One common approach was bloodletting, or phlebotomy. The physician would cut a vein, often in the arm, and allow some blood to drain out. This was believed to reduce excess blood and restore balance to the humours. Some physicians used leeches for the same purpose. Needless to say, this didn't help plague victims and likely weakened them further. Another approach was to lance the buboes, to cut them open and drain the pus. This was extremely painful, and there was no anaesthesia beyond perhaps strong alcohol or opium if you were fortunate. But some patients did survive after having their buboes lanced, leading to the belief that it was an effective treatment. In reality, these individuals might have survived anyway, or perhaps draining the buboes did help in some cases by removing some of the infected material. Modern medicine suggests that if the bacteria is localized primarily in the buboes, lancing might indeed have helped some patients. Various herbal remedies were also tried. Dried toad was applied to buboes. People consumed preparations of ground emeralds, 10-year-old treacle, a medicinal paste, and even arsenic. None of these was effective, and some were actively harmful. One of the most famous images associated with the Black Death is that of the plague doctor in his bird-like mask. However, this iconic outfit was actually developed later, in the 17th century, for subsequent outbreaks of plague. During the Black Death itself, physicians wore more ordinary clothing, though they might carry herbs or wear scented amulets that they believed would protect them from the disease. The beaked mask, when it was eventually developed, was filled with aromatic herbs and substances like rose petals, mint, camphor and vinegar. These were thought to purify the miasma, or bad air, that was believed to transmit the disease. The full plague doctor costume also included a long waxed coat, leather gloves, boots, a hat and a wooden cane. The cane was used to examine patients without touching them directly. While the costume didn't protect against flea bites, the actual vector of bubonic plague, the leather garments might have inadvertently provided some protection against flea-borne transmission. If medical treatments offered little hope, many turned to religion. The plague was widely seen as divine punishment for sins. Prayers, processions, and pilgrimages were organised to beg for God's mercy. Special masses were said, and new saints were invoked against the plague, particularly Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch. In many cities, authorities organised great processions where the populace would walk barefoot through the streets, carrying relics and chanting prayers. Unfortunately, these gatherings of many people in close proximity probably helped spread the disease further. In his chronicle of the plague in Siena, Italy, Agnolo di Tura wrote, "And people died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in those ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world." Some Christians took a different approach to appeasing God's wrath. Groups known as flagellants travelled from town to town, whipping themselves in public penance. These processions could draw large crowds of participants and spectators. The flagellants would enter a town, form a circle, and strip to the waist. Then they would beat themselves with whips studded with iron spikes, drawing blood as they chanted prayers and hymns. This would continue for 33.5 days, representing the years of Christ's life. The movement began in Germany and spread throughout Central Europe. At first it was tolerated or even encouraged by church authorities, but as the flagellants became more radical, challenging church authority and stirring up anti-Semitic violence, Pope Clement VI banned the movement in October 1349. Like the religious processions, these flagellant gatherings likely helped spread the plague further. One of the darkest aspects of the Black Death period was the persecution of minorities, especially Jews. As people searched for explanations for the plague, rumours spread that Jews were poisoning wells to cause the disease. These accusations were entirely false, but they led to horrific violence. In many towns and cities across Europe, Jewish communities were attacked. In Strasbourg, about 2,000 Jews were burned alive on February 14th, 1349. Similar massacres occurred in other German cities as well as in Switzerland, the Low Countries, and Spain. Pope Clement VI issued bulls denouncing these attacks and pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague, just like Christians, but his intervention had limited effect. Many Jewish survivors fled eastward to Poland and Russia, where King Casimir III of Poland offered them protection. This migration helped establish the large Jewish communities of Eastern Europe that would endure until the 20th century. Not all responses to the plague were violent or irrational. Some communities took practical measures that, while based on imperfect medical understanding, showed remarkable civic organisation. The concept of quarantine was developed during this period. The word comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. In 1377, the port city of Ragusa now Dubrovnik, Croatia, established a system requiring ships to anchor for 30 days, later extended to 40, before landing, to ensure they were not carrying disease. Similar measures were adopted by other cities. Venice appointed 3 health magistrates to enforce hygiene and restrict the movement of people and goods. They closed the port to suspected ships, isolated the sick in special hospitals called lazarettos, named after Lazarus, the biblical figure raised from the dead, and burned the clothes and belongings of plague victims. While these measures couldn't stop the plague entirely, they may have slowed its spread. The plague also prompted innovations in public health administration. Many cities established permanent health boards to monitor and respond to disease outbreaks. They kept detailed records of deaths, effectively creating some of the first public health statistics. These institutions would evolve over centuries into our modern public health systems. Daily life during the plague was transformed in countless ways. Social distancing, though not called by that name, was practiced by many who could afford it. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years, describes 10 young nobles who flee Florence for a country villa, where they entertain each other with stories while waiting out the plague. This was not fiction, but reflected what many wealthy individuals actually did. Those who remained in affected cities lived in fear and isolation. Many locked themselves in their homes, refusing to communicate with others except through windows. Food might be left at doorsteps. Business was conducted at a distance, with coins passed in vinegar, which was thought to disinfect them. When the plague struck a household, the authorities in many cities would lock the residents inside, effectively condemning both the sick and the healthy to remain together. A red cross was painted on the door, and guards might be posted to ensure no one left. This practice, known as shutting up, was terrifying for those inside, who had to watch their family members sicken and die, knowing they would likely be next. Some people bribed the guards or escaped through windows or adjoining buildings. Others simply resigned themselves to their fate. The economic impact of the Black Death was profound and far-reaching. The sudden loss of so much of the population disrupted every aspect of the economy. Fields went untended as peasants died or fled. Harvests failed, leading to food shortages. Guilds lost master craftsmen whose skills took years to develop. Trade networks collapsed as merchants died or refused to travel. But as devastating as these short-term effects were, the long-term economic consequences were more complex and in some ways beneficial for the survivors. The massive population decline created a labour shortage that dramatically improved the bargaining power of workers, especially peasants and urban craftsmen. Wages rose sharply. In England, the average wage increased by about 50% in the decades after the Black Death. Landlords facing a shortage of tenants had to offer better terms to attract workers to their estates. Many peasants were able to negotiate an end to traditional labour obligations or significant reductions in rent. This improvement in economic conditions for ordinary people was not welcomed by the ruling classes. In England, the government passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prohibit workers from moving to seek better opportunities. Similar laws were enacted in France and other countries, but these efforts to maintain the old economic order were largely unsuccessful. There simply weren't enough workers to meet the demand, and employers often ignored the wage controls to attract labour. The social fabric was strained as traditional bonds and obligations were broken. Family structures were shattered as parents, children, and siblings died. Many orphans were left to fend for themselves or taken in by relatives or neighbours. Widows and widowers remarried quickly, creating blended families. Property changed hands rapidly as heirs died before they could claim their inheritance, and estates were consolidated in the hands of survivors. The plague also affected patterns of social mobility. As established families died out, newcomers could rise to prominence. In Florence, for example, many old patrician families disappeared, making room for new men to enter the ranks of the elite. This renewal of the ruling class may have contributed to the extraordinary cultural flowering of the Renaissance that would begin in Italy in the following century. The psychological impact of living through such catastrophe must have been enormous, though medieval people left fewer direct records of their inner lives than we might wish. Contemporary chroniclers described a range of reactions, from extreme religious devotion to hedonistic abandonment of moral restraints. Boccaccio wrote that some people maintained that an infallible way of warding off this appalling evil was to drink heavily, enjoy life to the full, go round singing and merrymaking, gratify all of one's cravings whenever the opportunity offered, and shrug the whole thing off as one enormous joke. Others turned inward, becoming more ascetic and spiritual. New forms of religious devotion emerged, focusing on personal experience rather than formal rituals. This trend would eventually contribute to the religious reforms of the 15th and 16th centuries. The plague also left its mark on art and literature. Before the Black Death, medieval art had largely focused on idealized religious subjects. After the plague, there was a new emphasis on the physical reality of death and the transience of earthly life. The theme of memento mori, remember that you will die, became common. One artistic motif that emerged directly from the plague experience was the danse macabre, or dance of death. These were visual representations, often painted on church walls, showing death, personified as a skeleton, leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, merchants, peasants, in a dance to the grave. The message was clear: death comes for everyone, regardless of wealth or status. These images served as both a warning and a comfort in a society still reeling from catastrophic loss. As time passed, and we move into the period where Europe began to recover from the initial devastation of the Black Death, new social and economic patterns emerged. As time passed and we move into the period where Europe began to recover from the initial devastation of the Black Death, new social and economic patterns emerged. The plague didn't disappear after its first terrible visitation. Instead, it returned periodically throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, though never again with the same devastating mortality as the initial outbreak. These recurrences helped maintain the demographic changes brought about by the first wave. Europe's population would not return to its pre-plague levels until the 16th century. The aftermath of the Black Death saw significant changes in religious practice and authority. The Catholic Church, which had been the dominant institution in medieval Europe, suffered both practical and spiritual damage. Practically, the Church lost many priests and monks who died ministering to the sick. In some dioceses, up to 45% of the clergy perished. This created a shortage of trained religious personnel, leading to the hasty ordination of younger and less educated men. The quality of religious instruction and leadership declined as a result. More profoundly, the Church's spiritual authority was undermined by its apparent powerlessness in the face of the plague. Prayers, processions, and penances had failed to stop the disease. Many questioned why God would permit such suffering among the faithful. Some theologians argued that the plague was divine punishment for human sin, but this explanation rang hollow for many who had watched innocent children and pious clergy die alongside supposed sinners. In response to this crisis of faith, many Christians turned to more personal and mystical forms of devotion. There was increased interest in direct spiritual experience, unmediated by priests or church rituals. Lay religious movements grew in popularity. Books of devotion in vernacular languages rather than Latin allowed ordinary people to pursue spiritual lives outside the formal structures of the church. This trend toward more individualistic religion would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The plague also affected the physical environment of medieval Europe. As populations declined, Many small villages were completely abandoned. Fields reverted to forest or were converted to pasture for sheep, which required less labour than growing crops. In England, this shift towards sheep farming was particularly pronounced, laying the foundations for the country's later woolen textile industry. Urban areas changed as well. Some towns shrank dramatically, with abandoned neighbourhoods falling into ruin. Others maintained their physical size but became less densely populated, allowing for more spacious living conditions for the survivors. Many cities used the opportunity to improve their infrastructure, widening streets, constructing public fountains, and establishing better waste disposal systems. These changes, motivated partly by the belief that cleaner cities would be less vulnerable to disease, represent some of the first urban planning efforts in European history. The plague had particularly interesting effects on marriage patterns and family life. With so many deaths, there were numerous widows and widowers seeking new partners. Remarriage rates soared in the years after the plague. Women, who previously might have had limited options for marriage, now found themselves in greater demand. In some places, this improved women's bargaining position and led to more favourable marriage contracts. The age of marriage decreased as labour shortages made young workers more valuable. Couples tended to establish independent households earlier, rather than living with extended family. Family sizes increased as people tried to replace the lost population, though high child mortality rates continued to limit population growth. All these changes contributed to a slow shift toward the nuclear family as the predominant household structure in Western Europe. The economic aftermath of the Black Death varied by region and social class. For surviving peasants in Western Europe, conditions generally improved. Labour shortages gave them unprecedented bargaining power. Many were able to negotiate an end to traditional obligations, like forced labour on the lord's land. Rents decreased and wages increased. Some peasants were able to acquire land of their own, becoming small independent farmers. In Eastern Europe, however, the aftermath of the plague saw an increase in serfdom and bondage. Landlords, facing the same labour shortages as their Western counterparts, responded differently. Rather than competing for workers by offering better conditions, they used legal and political means to bind peasants more tightly to the land. In Poland, Hungary and Russia, new laws restricted peasant movement and increased labour obligations. This divergence in labour systems between Eastern and Western Europe would have profound long-term consequences for the economic and political development of these regions. For urban workers and artisans, the post-plague era was generally prosperous. Like rural labourers, they benefited from increased wages due to labour shortages. In many cities, craft guilds gained greater political influence. Guild regulations were often relaxed to allow faster admission of new members to replace those lost to the plague. This created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed before. The merchant and entrepreneurial classes faced a mixed picture. On one hand, the disruption of trade networks and the general economic contraction caused by population decline hurt many businesses. On the other hand, the survivors often inherited substantial property and capital from deceased relatives, leading to wealth concentration. This accumulated capital sought investment opportunities, stimulating new business ventures and financial innovations. Banking systems developed further, and early forms of insurance emerged to mitigate the risks of trade in an uncertain world. For the nobility and landholding classes, the Black Death initially brought economic hardship. Their income, derived largely from rents and labour services from peasants, declined sharply. Many responded by attempting to enforce old obligations through legal means or even violence. This led to tensions and sometimes open conflict with peasants and urban workers. In England, these tensions culminated in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Triggered by attempts to enforce a poll tax, the revolt saw thousands of peasants march on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler and other local organisers. They demanded an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and the removal of corrupt officials. For several days, the rebels controlled parts of London, burning records and properties associated with royal authority and the hated tax collectors. The 14-year-old King Richard II initially agreed to the rebels' demands, but after Tyler was killed during a meeting with the king, the revolt lost momentum and was suppressed. The government later revoked the concessions made during the crisis. Similar uprisings occurred elsewhere in Europe. France experienced the Jacquerie in 1358, a violent peasant rebellion that was brutally suppressed by the nobility. Florence saw the Ciompi Revolt of 1378, led by textile workers demanding political rights. Though these revolts were generally unsuccessful in achieving their immediate aims, they reflected the social tensions unleashed by the demographic and economic changes following the Black Death. Over the longer term, they contributed to the gradual erosion of feudal obligations in Western Europe. The post-plague period also saw significant developments in medical theory and practice. While the fundamental understanding of disease remained limited by modern standards, there were important practical innovations. Universities established more medical faculties and expanded their curricula. Physicians began to conduct autopsies more frequently to better understand human anatomy. Hospitals were founded or expanded in many cities. Public health measures became more sophisticated. The quarantine system, first developed in Italian port cities, was refined and adopted more widely. Venice established the first permanent health magistracy in 1486, staffed by nobles who oversaw the city's defences against disease. Other cities followed suit. These institutions kept records of deaths, inspected ships and goods, isolated the sick, and enforced cleaning of streets and public spaces. They represent the beginnings of systematic public health administration in Europe. The plague's impact extended beyond Europe. The disease also ravaged parts of the Islamic world, including Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. The Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and Syria, was particularly hard hit. Cairo, one of the largest cities in the medieval world, may have lost half its population. The economic and political consequences were similar to those in Europe. Labour shortages, rising wages, and challenges to traditional authority structures. China too suffered from plague outbreaks during this period, though the timing and severity are less well documented than in Europe. The disease appears to have contributed to the fall of the Yuan dynasty, founded by the Mongols, and its replacement by the native Ming dynasty in 1368. Like their European counterparts, Chinese authorities attempted to understand and control the disease, drawing on their own medical traditions. The plague followed trade routes throughout Asia, affecting India, Central Asia, and parts of Russia. In some regions, mortality may have been even higher than in Europe. These population losses contributed to significant political realignments across Eurasia. The weakening of the Mongol Empire, which had created a vast zone of economic and cultural exchange across Asia, may have been partly due to the demographic collapse caused by the plague. As European society gradually stabilized in the 15th century, the memory of the Black Death remained vivid. The plague had become part of the cultural consciousness, influencing art, literature, and popular customs. The danse macabre, or dance of death, which we mentioned earlier, continued to be a common artistic motif. These macabre images, showing death leading people of all social ranks to the grave, reflected a society still processing collective trauma. Religious art also showed the influence of plague experiences. Images of Saint Sebastian, who was invoked against plague, became more common. Traditionally depicted as a young man tied to a post and pierced with arrows, representing the arrows of plague, Sebastian became one of the most frequently painted saints in the 15th century. Similar popularity was enjoyed by Saint Roch, who, according to legend, had survived the plague himself and devoted his life to caring for plague victims. He was typically shown revealing a bubo on his thigh, the characteristic symptom of bubonic plague. Literary works also reflected the plague's impact. Boccaccio's Decameron, which we mentioned earlier, was perhaps the most famous literary response to the Black Death. Written in the immediate aftermath of the plague in Florence, it presents a framed narrative of 10 young nobles who flee the city for a country estate, where they entertain each other by telling stories. The contrast between the horror of the plague-stricken city, described in the introduction, and the often humorous or erotic tales told by the characters reflects the psychological complexity of the plague experience. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, similarly shows a society in which awareness of death coexists with an appetite for life. Though the plague is not directly mentioned, the pilgrimage framework, a journey to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, presumably to give thanks for survival or to pray for protection, takes place in a world where mortality is ever present. Yet the pilgrims are vividly alive, telling tales that celebrate human ingenuity, desire, and resilience. The plague also influenced the development of vernacular literature. With many Latin-educated clergy dead, and a new audience of literate laypeople seeking spiritual guidance outside traditional channels, there was increased demand for religious and philosophical works in local languages. In England, this period saw the flourishing of Middle English religious texts like The Cloud of Unknowing and the works of Julian of Norwich. Similar developments occurred in other European languages. This shift from Latin to vernacular languages would have profound long-term implications for European cultural and religious life. The economic changes brought about by the Black Death also contributed to technological innovation. With labour now more expensive, there was increased incentive to develop labour-saving devices. Watermills and windmills became more common and were adapted for new purposes beyond grinding grain, such as sawing wood, fulling cloth, and powering bellows for blast furnaces. Mechanical clocks, which had begun to appear in major European cities in the early 14th century, became more widespread after the plague. These devices not only displayed time, but helped regulate urban activities and labour, particularly important in a world where workers had more bargaining power. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, emerged in a Europe still shaped by the aftermath of the Black Death. The plague had created a society in which wealth was more concentrated among a smaller population, increasing the purchasing power of individual consumers. There was demand for books from a more educated laity interested in both religious and secular knowledge. And the labour shortage made the mechanisation of book production an attractive investment. While it would be an oversimplification to say that the plague directly caused the development of printing, the post-plague social and economic environment certainly helped make the new technology commercially viable. The plague also left its mark on legal systems and governance. Many cities developed detailed plague ordinances specifying how to respond to disease outbreaks. These regulations covered everything, from the inspection of incoming travellers and goods to the disposal of the dead and the cleaning of infected houses. They represent some of the first examples of comprehensive public health legislation. More broadly, the social disruption caused by the plague led to the revision of many laws and customs. Inheritance laws were clarified to deal with situations where multiple family members died in quick succession. Labour regulations were revised, often repeatedly, as authorities tried to control the rising cost of wages. Property laws evolved to address the transfer of land in a time of rapid demographic change. These legal developments reflected a society forced to adapt to new realities. The plague continued to recur periodically throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, though never with the same devastating mortality as the initial outbreak of 1347 to 1351. These later outbreaks, while still serious, were often more localised and better managed, thanks to improved public health measures. Quarantine became more effective as it was more systematically enforced. Cities developed early warning systems, with networks of observers reporting disease outbreaks in neighbouring regions. Trade routes could be temporarily closed, and travellers from affected areas isolated. Despite these improvements, plague remained a dreaded visitor. London experienced severe outbreaks in 1563, 1593, 1603, and most famously in 1665, the Great Plague described so vividly by Samuel Pepys and Daniel Defoe. Venice was struck repeatedly throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Marseille suffered a major outbreak as late as 1720, one of the last in Western Europe. Each recurrence reinforced the cultural memory of the disease and spurred further refinements in public health responses. The gradual retreat of plague from Western Europe by the early 18th century remains something of a mystery. Better public health measures surely played a role, but they cannot fully explain the disease's disappearance. Changes in the rat population, either in numbers or in the species predominant in European cities, may have been important. The black rat, the main carrier in medieval times, was gradually replaced in many areas by the brown rat, which lives farther from humans. Climate changes might have affected both rat and flea populations. Some scientists have even suggested that humans developed greater genetic resistance to the disease after centuries of exposure, though this remains speculative. Most likely, a combination of all these factors contributed to the plague's retreat. The Black Death marks a pivotal moment in European and world history. Its immediate impact was catastrophic, causing tens of millions of deaths and untold suffering, but its long-term consequences were complex and not entirely negative. The post-plague world saw improved conditions for many workers, increased social mobility, technological innovation, and new approaches to public health and governance. The cultural and psychological impact of living through such a catastrophe contributed to new forms of artistic expression and religious practice. Gradually, as the centuries rolled forward, the direct memory of the Black Death faded, though it remained present in art, literature, and folk wisdom. Gradually, as the centuries rolled forward, the direct memory of the Black Death faded, though it remained present in art, literature, and folk wisdom. It was not until the 19th century that scientific understanding of the plague began to advance significantly. The development of germ theory by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch revolutionized the understanding of infectious diseases. For the first time, specific microorganisms could be identified as the causes of specific diseases. In 1894, during an outbreak of plague in Hong Kong, the bacterium responsible for the disease was independently identified by two scientists, the Japanese physician Shibasaburo Kitasato and the French-Swiss bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin. The bacterium was named Yersinia pestis in honour of Yersin. Shortly thereafter, researchers established that the disease was primarily spread by fleas that had fed on infected rats. This discovery finally explained why plague had been so difficult to control using traditional quarantine methods, which focused on human-to-human transmission. Effective control required addressing the rat population and the fleas they carried. The third plague pandemic, which began in China in the 1850s and spread globally by the 1890s, killed approximately 12 million people, primarily in India and China. Unlike earlier pandemics, this one occurred during the age of modern medicine and international scientific cooperation. Research conducted during this pandemic led to the development of the first effective plague treatments and preventive measures. In 1896, Waldemar Hafkan developed the first plague vaccine, which he tested on himself before using it in India. While not perfect, the vaccine reduced the risk of infection and was widely used in affected areas. The discovery of antibiotics in the mid-20th century provided even more effective treatments. Streptomycin, discovered in 1943, was the first antibiotic shown to be effective against plague. Today, several antibiotics can successfully treat the disease if administered promptly. With modern treatment, the mortality rate for bubonic plague has dropped from 60 to 80% to about 10%. Modern archaeological and scientific techniques have allowed researchers to confirm that the Black Death was indeed caused by Yersinia pestis. DNA extracted from the teeth of plague victims buried in mass graves across Europe contains genetic material matching this bacterium. Moreover, genetic analysis has revealed that the strain of Y. pestis that caused the medieval pandemic was the ancestor of most plague strains circulating today. These scientific advances have not only clarified the historical record, but also helped dispel some misconceptions about the Black Death. For instance, some historians had proposed alternative causes for the pandemic, such as anthrax or a viral hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola. Genetic evidence has conclusively ruled out these theories. Similarly, the notion that the disease spread directly from person to person through coughing or touch, a belief held by many medieval people and reflected in some historical accounts, has been shown to be only partially correct. While pneumonic plague can spread this way, the primary vector was indeed rat fleas. The plague has not disappeared from the world. It remains endemic in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, with several thousand cases reported annually. The United States typically sees a handful of cases each year, primarily in rural areas of western states, where the bacterium exists in populations of wild rodents. Madagascar experienced a significant outbreak as recently as 2017, with over 2,000 confirmed or suspected cases. Modern plague control relies on a combination of public health surveillance, prompt medical treatment, and environmental management to reduce rodent populations in human habitations. The World Health Organization monitors plague activity globally and provides assistance to affected regions. While localized outbreaks still occur, the disease is now well understood and, with proper resources, controllable. A global pandemic like the Black Death is highly unlikely in the modern world, thanks to antibiotics, improved sanitation, and better understanding of disease transmission. The legacy of the Black Death extends far beyond medicine and public health. Historians continue to debate its long-term impact on European society, economy, and culture. Some see it as a turning point that accelerated the end of feudalism, contributed to the rise of centralized states, and helped pave the way for the Renaissance and eventually the modern era. Others caution against attributing too much to a single event, however dramatic, pointing out that many trends visible after the plague had begun before it struck. What seems clear is that the Black Death intensified and accelerated changes that were already underway. The crisis of feudalism, the growth of commercial capitalism, the development of national identities, and the questioning of traditional religious authority, all these processes were happening before 1347, but all were profoundly affected by the demographic shock of the pandemic. The plague acted as a catalyst, rapidly transforming European society in ways that might otherwise have taken centuries. The Black Death has left linguistic traces that persist to this day. The children's rhyme Ring Around the Rosy is often claimed to refer to the plague, though many folklorists dispute this interpretation. More reliably, phrases like God bless you after a sneeze are linked to plague-era beliefs that sneezing was an early symptom of infection. The word quarantine itself, as we mentioned earlier, comes from the Italian 40 giorni, the 40-day isolation period imposed on ships during plague outbreaks. Archaeological evidence of the Black Death continues to be uncovered. Mass graves from the period are occasionally found during construction projects in European cities. In 2013, workers building a new railway line in London discovered a burial pit containing over 40 plague victims. In 2015, archaeologists in Barcelona found a mass grave with 120 bodies buried during the initial outbreak. These discoveries provide valuable opportunities for scientific analysis of the disease and the people it affected. Popular culture continues to be fascinated by the Black Death. Films, novels, and video games set during the plague era often use the pandemic as a backdrop for exploring human responses to crisis. Some emphasize the breakdown of social order and the emergence of barbarism, while others focus on resilience and compassion amid suffering. The plague doctor, with his beaked mask and eerie silhouette, has become an iconic image, appearing in everything from horror movies to carnival costumes. The Black Death has also become a reference point for understanding other disease outbreaks. During the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, commentators drew parallels to the plague, noting similarities in social responses such as stigmatization of victims and the search for scapegoats. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic prompted renewed interest in the Black Death as people sought historical perspectives on their own experiences of a global disease outbreak. While the mortality rate and medical context of COVID-19 differ dramatically from those of the medieval plague, certain social and psychological responses, fear, uncertainty, the tension between economic concerns and public health, the spread of misinformation show striking similarities across the centuries. Medieval responses to the plague can seem primitive and ineffective from a modern perspective. Bloodletting, herbal amulets, and mass religious processions did little to stop the spread of a bacterial infection transmitted by flea bites. Yet some of the public health measures developed during and after the Black Death were remarkably sophisticated given the medical knowledge of the time. Quarantine, isolation of the sick, careful disposal of contaminated objects, and restrictions on public gatherings were all rational approaches that anticipated modern infection control practices. Without understanding germ theory, medieval authorities nonetheless recognized that the disease could somehow be transmitted from sick to healthy people and from affected to unaffected areas. The Black Death also provides a cautionary tale about the dangers of scapegoating and persecution during health crises. The massacres of Jewish communities, based on wholly false accusations of well poisoning, represent one of the darkest episodes associated with the plague. Similar patterns of blame and persecution recurred during later outbreaks. During a plague epidemic in Milan in 1630, suspected plague spreaders were tortured and executed based on rumours that they were deliberately infecting others. As recently as the 19th century, cholera outbreaks in Europe and America led to violence against immigrants and minority groups who were accused of causing or spreading the disease. These historical examples highlight how fear and uncertainty during epidemics can exacerbate existing social tensions and lead to the victimization of marginalized groups. The role of the Black Death in shaping modern medicine and public health cannot be overstated. The institutional and conceptual foundations of public health as a government responsibility were laid during and after the plague. Venice's health magistracy, established in 1486, is sometimes described as the world's first public health department. The idea that government has a duty to protect population health through systematic monitoring and intervention emerged directly from plague experiences. Similarly, the practice of keeping detailed records of births, deaths, and disease cases, fundamental to modern epidemiology and public health surveillance, developed in response to plague outbreaks. The bills of mortality, weekly reports of burials compiled in London from the late 16th century onward, became more detailed and systematic during plague years. In the 1660s, John Grote analysed these records to identify patterns in death rates, creating what is now considered one of the founding documents of demography and epidemiology. The plague's impact on medical education was also significant. The need for more physicians during and after the pandemic led to the expansion of medical faculties at universities. The curriculum gradually became more practical and less theoretical, with increased emphasis on anatomy and clinical observation. Plague treatises, manuals written by physicians to guide colleagues and authorities during outbreaks, represent an early form of public health literature, combining medical theory with practical advice on prevention and treatment. The psychological impact of living through the Black Death is difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. The sudden loss of so many friends, family members, and neighbours must have been profoundly traumatic. Contemporary accounts describe people becoming numb to death after witnessing so much of it. Some embraced hedonism, reasoning that they might die tomorrow. Others turned to extreme religious devotion. Many survivors exhibited what we might now recognise as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, though of course this concept didn't exist at the time. The plague's high mortality rate meant that many children were orphaned. Some were taken in by relatives or neighbours, but others were left to fend for themselves. The fate of these plague orphans varied widely. Some became beggars or thieves, others were exploited as cheap labour. A few benefited from inheritance if they were the sole survivors of wealthy families. The disruption of normal family structures had long-lasting effects on the social fabric of affected communities. One of the most poignant aspects of the Black Death is how it affected individuals' sense of their place in the world. Medieval Europeans lived in a cosmos they believed was ordered and meaningful, governed by divine providence. The plague challenged this worldview. Why would a benevolent God permit such suffering? Why did the pious die alongside sinners? The inability of religious authorities to explain or prevent the catastrophe led some to question traditional teachings. This questioning did not immediately lead to secularization. Indeed, many people became more religious, rather than less so in the wake of the plague. But the nature of religious practice and belief began to change. There was greater emphasis on direct personal religious experience rather than institutional mediation. The idea that individuals could interpret scripture for themselves and develop their own relationship with God gained traction. These trends would eventually contribute to the Reformation and the fragmentation of Western Christianity. One curious cultural development following the Black Death was an increased preoccupation with death in art and literature. The danse macabre, or dance of death, which we mentioned earlier, became a common motif. These images showed death personified as a skeleton, leading people from all walks of life, popes, emperors, peasants, children, in a dance to the grave. The message was that death comes for everyone, regardless of wealth or status. This theme of mortality was not merely morbid, but reflected a society processing collective trauma while seeking to extract meaning from it. Similarly, the memento mori, remember that you will die, became a common theme in art and personal possessions. Small decorative skulls, often exquisitely carved, reminded the owner of life's brevity and the need to prepare for judgment. Tomb sculptures became more realistic in depicting the deceased, sometimes including macabre elements like carved images of the body in decay, a stylistic innovation known as transitombs. This preoccupation with death, however, coexisted with a celebration of life and its pleasures. The same period saw increased interest in classical learning, beauty, and worldly achievement. Having witnessed how quickly life could end, many people focused more intently on making their mark in this world, rather than merely preparing for the next. This tension between awareness of mortality and embrace of earthly life is a defining characteristic of Renaissance humanism, which emerged in plague-ravaged Italy in the decades following the Black Death. In our own time, the Black Death has taken on new relevance as a point of comparison for contemporary disease outbreaks. While modern medicine and public health infrastructure make a pandemic of similar proportions highly unlikely, the medieval experience still offers valuable insights. The psychological and social responses to widespread disease, fear, denial, scapegoating, but also compassion and cooperation, show remarkable continuities across centuries. The plague reminds us of both human vulnerability to disease and human resilience in the face of it. The Black Death also serves as a reminder of how profoundly disease outbreaks can reshape societies. The interconnected world of the 21st century, with its global travel and trade, bears some similarities to the Eurasian trade networks that facilitated the plague's spread in the 14th century. Modern public health systems, with their emphasis on surveillance, preparation, and coordinated response, represent the culmination of institutional developments that began during the plague era. In studying the Black Death, we see not only a catastrophe from the distant past, but also the origins of how we understand and respond to disease today. As our journey through the Black Death comes to a close, I hope this exploration has helped ease your mind and guide you toward peaceful sleep. History's gentle rhythms continue to flow, just as they have for countless generations before us. If this boring historical narrative has helped you find rest tonight, remember that your like and subscription directly support our mission to create more of these sleep-inducing histories. Your engagement helps other insomniacs discover these narratives too. What historical period would you like us to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. Until next time, good night and pleasant dreams.